Do you believe in science? Do you believe in God? Sorry, I know that's kind of a touchy subject. Even though we go to a Christian school, people are still really sensitive about talking about their belief in God. Today I'm going to talk about faith and science and the interaction between the two. We're also going to talk about philosophy and why Christianity should be talked about in the classroom and how it should be a bigger issue at Pepperdine University. My thesis is Christianity is an easily defendable viewpoint in the scientific and philosophical world and should be addressed by a Christian university. Alright, so to start, we're going to talk about Darwinism and neo-Darwinism and evolution. This is the primary viewpoint of science. Science likes to say that we don't need a God, we can explain the world without a God, and so this is what they argue for. This was all started by this man right here, Charles Darwin. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species, right here. In it, he talks about how humans and other animals reproduce faster than the world can handle. No two organisms also have identical DNA. These are kind of his starting points. From here, he goes into talking about natural selection and survival of the fittest. Essentially, the idea is that we can't have every organism surviving that animals and humans produce, so only the fittest will survive. And that, to him, means that the organisms with the most optimal DNA will survive. As this happens, he believes in macro evolution, which means that as certain organisms survive and some die, new species will be created. Today, this is called neo-Darwinism. All of this information came from Jerry A. Kahn, a PhD of ecology and evolution at the University of Chicago. A primary reason that Darwin arrived at this was from Haeckel's drawings. Right here you can see Haeckel's drawings. He shows how an embryo, a fish, a salamander, a turtle, chicken, rabbit, and a human all look to be essentially the same. Keith R. Benson, a PhD of medical ethics and history at the University of Washington, writes about how this is just completely untrue. Haeckel just made these things up pretty much. He just drew them, where right below you can see this is what the actual embryos look like. So they really show no resemblance to each other, very little. So Darwin partially based his theory on this and assumed that we have a common ancestor. You can look at all animals and humans and kind of trace them up through time to this common ancestor ways in the past. Alright, but this also does not really hold up. All here you can see Precambrian time. Then about 571 million years ago, Cambrian time started. According to Darwin, during Precambrian time, there had been all this evolution from one common ancestor, but this is just not what we see. This is Darwin's view. These are the fossils that we've seen in what became known as the Cambrian explosion about 570 million years ago, and this is what Darwin assumed. They all led down to these common ancestors, like that. But this is what we actually see. So on this one, the red is where we actually have fossils. The yellow squares or circle things are where it's been eliminated. So as you can see, instead of all coming down to this common ancestor, every red line just goes straight up, just like that. So really what happened is that about 570 million years ago, we just had this explosion where 35 out of the 40 main animal groups we have today all just suddenly appeared in the fossil record. Darwinists or neo-Darwinists will say that we just still haven't found the common ancestor, that it's still out there, or that possibly what happened is these records are so old for this common ancestor that we just can't find it because it's all destroyed. Unfortunately for them, we can find single-cell organisms and bacteria in the fossil record from up to 3 billion years ago. So if there was a common ancestor, we would find it. Alright, microevolution. UC Berkeley has a website essentially trying to convince you of neo-Darwinism and evolution, and in it details a little bit about microevolution. Right here we have the American house sparrow. This is a common example of microevolution because as it came to North America, in northern parts of the United States, it's a lot larger, and in the southern parts of the United States, it's a lot smaller. Neo-Darwinists will say that this is because in the north, it's a lot colder, and so it needs the extra feathers and fat in order to insulate it so that it can survive in the colder temperatures, where in the south, it needs to be a lot smaller so that it can survive in the cold. In the warm. Another example they used is, right here we have HIV, and what's happened is it's kind of evolved, and it's been able to resist antiviral vaccines. Another example is the peppered moth. So with the peppered moth, this was one that Darwin looked at, actually. And during the Industrial Revolution, you had a change. It kind of looked like this in London, and then during the Industrial Revolution, it started to look like this, a lot darker. And so this was deemed microevolution. The world became a lot more polluted, and so the peppered moth evolved. It got darker so that it couldn't be seen as well. This is natural selection, because the whiter ones wouldn't blend into the trees and with all the pollution, so they would die, and the ones that had this darker color would survive. So this one was fitter, and so it survived. In this study right here, though, or this news article, we see a different story. In the 2009 UK edition of the Daily Mail, they talk about how today these moths are also turning back to white, and now about 60% of them are white, and about 40% have this darker black color. So I asked, he was a dad of a friend of mine who I really respect. His name's Dr. Stephen Meyer. He studied at the University of Cambridge and got his PhD, and then ultimately founded the Discovery Institute, which is the leading institution for creationism. And I asked him about this, and he said what actually happened is that these moths don't have any difference in DNA. There was no mutation. All that happened is that certain ones survived longer. So the same number would be born, but the white ones would die early in their life, or the black ones would survive, where now it's starting to flip. So there was no DNA mutation, there was no actual evolution. It was just a phenomenon. Alright, this is a quote from Dr. Stephen Meyer, and while it is really long, I think it really explains properly why Neo-Darwinism cannot be viewed as true. This quote is in an article of Dr. Stephen Meyer's called Darwin's Dilemma: Misrepresent the Mechanism or Face the Facts. It goes like this. Why a formidable challenge? Because random mutations alone must produce exceedingly rare functional sequences among a vast combinatorial sea of possible sequences before natural selection can play any significant role. Moreover, as I discuss in Toronto and show in more detail in Darwin's Doubt, every replication event in the entire multi-billion-year history of life on Earth would not generate or search, but a minuscule fraction of the total number of possible nucleotide-based amino acid sequences corresponding to a single functional gene or protein fold. The number of trials available to the evolutionary process, corresponding to the total number of organisms, is 10 to the 40th that have ever existed on Earth. Thus, turns out to be an incredibly small in relation to the number of possible sequences that need to be searched. The threshold of selectable function exceeds what is reasonable to expect a random search to be able to accomplish, given the number of trials available to the search, even assuming evolutionary deep time. So this is obviously a very deep and hard to process quote, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. Basically, what are the odds of one successful mutation of DNA? Typically, when you think of mutation, you don't think of a good thing. And this is true. Here you can see one lock, and there's 100 or 1,000 possible combinations there. 10,000 on this one. The odds of one successful mutation are 1 times 10 to the 77th, according to Dr. Axe. There's also been 1 times 10 to the 40th total organisms in the history of Earth. So that means that this is the odds of one successful mutation. That makes Darwinism really hard to believe. Alright, so, in conclusion, should you believe in science? Yes. Should you believe in God? I certainly do. You should apply this to your daily life and think about how evolution, science, and God correspond. Unfortunately, Pepperdine doesn't really talk about this. In one of my chemistry classes, the professor even joked about how we're never going to talk about God and it's kind of irrelevant. So I would urge you guys to talk to your professors about this and also to consider asking the religion department for a class where we can talk about faith and God and science and also philosophy. Thank you.